Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us again. I'm sure wherever you are, it's snowy and cold, perhaps. And we're so honored again to have Dr. Elsa Cardenas-Hagen joining us. And also joining us with her is Dr. Antonio Fierro. We're so excited to have you back as well. My name is Dr. Pam Kastner, and I have the honor of serving as Patent State Lead for Literacy. Joining me this evening are my colleagues and friends, Lisa Bola, Kirsten DeRoche, Amy Cavalier, and Francine Dutrasik. So thank you to our team and mostly to Antonio and Elsa. Boy, Elsa's had quite the week here. As if you've been watching the news, you certainly know what's happening in Texas, and certainly everyone in Texas is in our thoughts and prayers. And gosh, Elsa, just to even be here is really something. We just want to thank you so very much.
Thank you.
We are
Thank
shifting
you.
ahead a chapter because Colleen also lives in Texas and has had some hurdles to overcome. So we are going to jump ahead to chapter 7 and focus on vocabulary this evening. But we really want to thank Elsa. She really
Thank
has
you.
been, she and everyone in Texas has been through so much this week. So thank you, Elsa, so much for
Yeah,
being
you're
here with
so
us this evening.
welcome. Thank you. So I'm very glad to be here and to join you this evening. And I am not in my home. I am in my son's home, and he has 3 little children. So if some of them come in here and if you hear crying or little toddlers, you'll know that it's really me this time. So I am delighted that he has electricity, and hopefully I will get electricity sometime this week or weekend. And so we're excited. I'm excited to be here, and I thank you for joining. And I know that most of this country, about 78% of the country, has been affected by a winter storm. And so I hope that you're able to keep warm and safe, and that you will be okay. And so this evening, we were going to do the chapter on fluency, which would have been chapter 6. And Dr. Carlson is not able to join us this evening, just kind of spotty electricity. And we just thought it would be a better idea to hold off till next week. And that worked out okay because Dr. Sherilyn Durdola was not going to be able to participate for this chapter on vocabulary. And so I said, I'll just move it forward. And we made that decision today. And so here we are. And I'm excited to bring to you. And unfortunately, Sherilyn Durdola, Paula Durdola, we've been colleagues for, I guess, more than 25 years. And we started our work together on the National Institute for Child Health and Human Development and the biliteracy research initiatives for the United States to really know about Spanish speaking students learning English, and what did we need to do for these students. And so we worked together when she was in Texas, and she is now at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. And so we have just completed another project together in where we're really looking at, the teacher preparation and about being really prepared for, these multilingual learners and the systems for multilingualism. And what's really interesting is you'll get to hear some about her work. So she, after we worked for so many years together on interventions and, really helping children who struggle with reading, she really focused then on making sure that the early interventions and making sure that young children had all of these opportunities. And so tonight you'll get to hear about some of Dr. Duradola's work and Dr. Gonzalez and its amazing work. And so I will be so happy to highlight that as she highlighted it in this chapter. So I'm excited to have those discussions with you and kind of a little bit of insight about where we've been, where we are, and where we're going for the future. Because it's what I want to let you know is we don't know everything. We have spent some significant time and in looking at this population of students, but we still have much more to do. And there was a question posed of me today, and I was like, we really have the answer, but that answer is sitting on our data sets of 50,000 kids. And, we haven't analyzed it. And I know the answer is in that sample, but it just takes so much time and effort to get the work done. And so what I was hoping that this book would be is that this book would really be a way to translate, the research that we have done and that our colleagues have done, and that through that we would be able to put some of this knowledge that we have into practice. And just know that when the best way to get information, I mean, is by the time we get our information out, I think the best way is when we can give some preliminary reports and some preliminary work. And so, I think that's the best way, because it takes years for your papers to get accepted and all of that. So tonight we'll be learning very clearly about vocabulary and English learners. And what I really love about this is that Dr. Duradola, in her writings of this chapter, she really focused on the foundations. And if you remember, if for those of you that have been here all and hanging in with us through every single week, but if you remember, when I had the opportunity to really discuss with you from the chapters in chapter 2 specifically, where I really was talking about oral language development and English learners. And what I really loved about Dr. Duradola's chapter is this is exactly where she started. And she started at the foundation. And I love that she gave credit to speech and language pathologists. She says, they really know so much about language. They have studied this, for so many years to get those credentials, but really to know that, we have this information, but we need the information that we have to get out to everybody. Everybody needs this information. And she really talks about, in the very introduction, she talks about how evident it is and how important those components of language are for building that word knowledge. And so, as you recall, when we were working in chapter 2, we talked about, well, what are those components of language? And, we know that phonology is a component that every language in the world has. And as you learned when we were working with Virginia Gonzalez, and we talked about, this phonological awareness development, and we talked about that being very clearly, a very universal skill. And so we see that even in the brain studies where right there in that left angular gyrus, we see it just kind of light up, and this is what we see no matter what the language is. And so, but knowing those phonological features of the words really helps you, and it really helps English learners, because you get to process, right, and hopefully discriminate, and then you get to produce so that you can read and write. And so that phonology is one of the important foundations of, not only, decoding and reading and the foundational skills of literacy, but very much focused on that word learning. Dr. Duradola talks about semantics being at that, word, understanding words and being able to use words. And we'll talk in length about how we can really structure the use of the words. We say that it takes 12 to 17 times to really know a word by using it. And so, we talk about those structured opportunities for use. And how important, this is for building word knowledge. But one of the things that we especially know for English learners and knowing words and word knowledge is morphology. And so the morpheme is that small unit of meaning, the smallest unit of meaning in a language. And by having that understanding as we, work with words and learn words, we can build many, many thousands of words by knowing, the parts of a word, those prefixes, roots, and suffixes. And as I spoke to you in chapter 2, we know that there's much that transfers across those languages, and that about 60% of the English language comes from Latin, about 15% comes from the Greek. And so just think about all the thousands of words we can build in the English language from Latin and Greek. And then as we look at syntax, really understanding about words and that structure. So Dr. Durodola will go and will describe to you as we move into the chapter some of the ways that we can kind of give this, meta linguistic capability, but really thinking about not only those sounds and how the sounds form words, but how those words function, and knowing that the words have multiple ways that they can be used and multiple ways that they can function in the English language. And that's so important. So it's really knowing in depth the understanding of words. And the fancy word for using language is called pragmatics. And as I mentioned to you in chapter 2, we talked about how really understanding, that social register of the language, that some of the ways we speak, for example, how I speak and in my home with my family members is very different with the speech and the choice of words and the use of words that I will use in a setting such as we have this evening in our book study. But what also falls under here are, that ability to really understand how words are used, and understanding those multiple uses of the words, but also understanding kind of like those regional dialects. And so or regional phrases, or and I know like idioms is one of the things that I'm always so fascinated in learning about where they come from. But all of this contributes to having a deep word knowledge and to having wonderful ability to build upon what they know. Are there any questions on that as we go back and we reflect, as Dr. Durodola has, on language and its relationship to vocabulary building? All right. Okay. So Dr. Durdola asked these questions. Why is vocabulary acquisition, why is this so important for English learners? And what we know is, we know that language is important, but now what I really love is that Dr. Durdola talks about content enriched vocabulary. And so what we know is that we use words for many variety of reasons, and that context is so important, and content. And what she describes there is the necessity of us having that direct, explicit instruction and opportunities, those daily structured opportunities, no matter what we're teaching, that word learning opportunities are there, and that there's vocabulary across all the content areas. And so what typically happens is, we tend not to be explicit or systematic in our approach to doing this kind of work. In one study that we did in science classrooms, can you imagine? So we were in science classrooms and, really working with our teachers in, really bringing in literacy and vocabulary and this word knowledge and word building strategies. Diane August was the PI on the project. And what we learned was, so PI means the principal investigator. And so as we were working on these, classrooms and making it content rich and rich vocabulary, we found that you're not going to believe this, but this is the truth. These were in 6th grade classrooms, and they had different teachers across the different content areas. So they were departmentalized, right? And so the persons who were teaching science taught science to the whole grade level. And so we thought it was going to be very problematic to do a research study that we call a randomized controlled study, where here's your treatment group, here's your control, and it's randomly selected. But how are we going to randomly select if it was the same teacher? So what we did is we did it at the class level. So period 1 was going to be the treatment. Period 2 was going to be the control. Period 3, treatment. Period 4, and so on and so forth. It was the same teacher all through the day, but in period 1, 3, and 5, implementing and working with us on the strategies for word learning and content learning. And the other periods of time, it was going to be business as usual. right? At the end of the study, what we found is by using these techniques that we know have evidence to them, really building upon that vocabulary and that text comprehension and really working on academic language and building the world knowledge. And guess what? We even did read alouds. And Dr. Durdola will talks about read alouds. Can you imagine that we got statistically significant results in our study? It was the same teacher, but just the approaches were, was what was manipulated, right? And even within the same teacher, that teacher had different outcomes depending on what was done. So that, what I thought was going to be a problem ended up being a stronger study to really demonstrate how it's the techniques and implementing these strategies that will really make that difference. So, bringing in vocabulary, working on that academic language, being very intentional, explicit, and systematic for that vocabulary and word building across the content areas. Okay, so as we think about that, Dr. Durdola talks about, those early language experiences and what we're finding more and more about this, that and I know you've read the Hart and Risley study, where this was a study where they looked at the lives and the language use and the word use of children that live in high income families, those that lived at the most middle kind of average socioeconomic level, and those that lived below that poverty level, and found that children who were 3 years of age that were in the average income, average socioeconomic level, and those that were in the advanced level spoke more words than the parents that were in those homes of poverty. And so we know how important, like, you're developing words and language even before that baby is born, right? And so that role of speaking to our children and giving them the opportunity to hear language and hear how it's developed in syntax, and bringing up the types of words, but not only incidental. Remember hearing about the depth and breadth of vocabulary, right? We think about, this was the meaningful differences in the lives of everyday, children. And then also thinking about Isabel Back and her colleagues and bringing words to life, talking about that depth of the language and really talking about how this is a critical component. Language, vocabulary it's going to tell us how well they'll have that higher level of reading comprehension. And in fact, there's been studies that show, that kindergarten vocabulary will predict reading comprehension in middle school years, and first grade vocabulary will predict 10 years later that reading comprehension. Keith Stanovich did those studies, and so we see how important this is, and especially important for students who are learning more than one language. And so as we look at this, we think about, what about the world of nature and the world of culture? And Sherilyn Durdola talks about that, about the sciences and the social sciences, and how important that is to having it from an asset point of view and building that cultural capital, that makes such a huge difference. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking about this as we're working with our English learners. And so we hear in the world of English learners this word that we call academic language, and I referred to kind of like social and informal to that academic language. And so when we work across these content areas, we're working on academic language, and we're thinking about that there's even standards for us to get to the academic language. And so very nice. Also in chapter 2, I discussed the new, Weda standards, the World Class Instructional Design and Assessment Consortium. And if you look here, how Dr. Duradola wrote this chapter on vocabulary, it was really following that, vocabulary and vocabulary building and language building, right, should be across those content areas. And so we use language for social and instructional purposes, and language for, language arts, the language of mathematics, the language of science, the language of social studies. But these standards go even further in saying, talking about the use of the language, and what point is it to tell a story? Is it to give more information? We want to make sure that we have this in all the different modalities. Some other national standards, the Tesol standards, just look here, also in Tesol, right? What we also find in this standards is that, yes, English learners are going to communicate, right, for their social, intercultural, instructional purposes, but also for the success in language arts, the success in mathematics, the success in science, the success in social studies. So you can see how these really follow along the work that Dr. Duradola has done, and that we've also done across the content areas for building students who are learning English as their second language, really building their vocabulary. So what does it take? What are we going to work on? So every student, including those who speak more than one language, every student brings to your classroom information, right? And they have already their own schema. They have their own knowledge base of what they know. And we want to build upon and work of what they know and build that vocabulary knowledge. And we're going to combine that information, what they already know, and we're going to deepen that knowledge and take it to a higher cognitive level. We want to make sure we know that teachers spend about 30% of their day really working on oral language, but we don't get those results. But what we want to get for these word learnings is we want to see that you're creating those multiple opportunities for using that new vocabulary, and they're making those connections always to the concepts that they know, and connections to their lived experiences, and then we build upon that, right? But what we also must be mindful in our classrooms as we work with our students is that adult and child language interaction. How are we going to design that? And remember, when we talked about also language, we talked about, how we develop those language samplings, and how we do those, open-ended questions, and how we get language from students. And so it really becomes somewhat of an art to do this, but we want that high quality adult child language interaction, and we want it all around that vocabulary development, all across the content areas, right? So now we get to talk about Sherilyn's work and on shared book reading. And so this is going to be very important. And this is and these studies and other studies like them are evidence-based. So everything in here has been really reviewed, peer-reviewed, and there's been numerous studies kind of doing and keeping enhancing, as every 5 years as the studies end, the next 5 years of studies to look at this has just continued to be enhanced. And so what do those strategies for teaching vocabulary skills to our English learners look like through that shared book reading experience? And so as we think about this, we want the shared book reading to be organized, and we want it to be organized by those content related themes. So in other words, in the studies that Sherilyn and her team did, and the studies that I was able to do with Diane August, we really organized the information and that shared book reading by the content related themes. So whatever they're studying, we bring in the readings that will help them to solidify that content learning, but also solidify that vocabulary learning that's around there, right? And so what we know is these repeated readings with multiple exposures to the words really gets some positive outcomes for our students. And all the while that we're doing this kind of work, we're bringing in, when we talk about non-linguistic visual supports, what we mean there is it's not really so much related to print. It's ways that we have visuals that really even can show very abstract concepts, but in concrete ways. And so in these kinds of studies, we have those non-linguistic visual supports. And that's going to be important. So I'll give you an example. So if something's like a miracle, and one of our things was showing this flower that was growing in the midst of winter. And so it was a miracle that that flower, could grow, and how did it grow in these winter conditions. And so the discussions around that. So it's having those structured conversations and opportunities to use language. We're going to use those visuals to discuss the terms in science and in social studies. This is very important. And as I mentioned to you, like, in speech and language, we already know, okay, these are my language targets, these are my vocabulary targets. I'm going to set up my teaching so that they can learn and they can have these opportunities to learn. So it's that intentional planning and then that execution of it. But you have to make it look so naturalistic. And so that's where I say it really becomes an art. And while we're doing this work, there's been lots of controversy whether you would even think about. Now it's like so funny. Everything that we do now is being questioned, whether it's, the right thing to do. But, students find it fascinating to know about the structure of the language and the history. So as we're teaching English, there's a history. There's a history to the social sciences. There's a history to science and how this all got developed. There's a history to languages, and there's a history to how even words made it into the English language, right? Those Anglo-Saxons, the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jutes, these three Germanic tribes, right? And these are where they were hunters and fishermen and farmers. And so any words that were common everyday words that were related to hunting and fishing and farming, these are going to be words that were Anglo-Saxon, and they were based upon that. And words that are Latin are these fancy words, right? With 3 and 4 syllables related. What are they going to be related? Oh, they're related to religion and to the court system. And then we have the Greeks. And what did the Greeks give us? They gave us the Olympics and sports, and they gave us medicine and science. And so words related, to science, like chemistry and chemicals, and words related to sports, like the Olympics and marathon and decathlon, and words related also to drama, the theater. And so all of that, knowing about that, then you know where those words come from, and then you can study those words. And one of the very effective strategies um, for learning words for English learners include what we call cognate instruction. And that's really understanding that there's words across languages that look very similar, and they look very similar in spelling, and they're very similar in meaning. And this is a very effective word learning strategy. And so we're not just giving them word for word for word, we're teaching them to use this as a technique when they come across words that they don't quite understand, to use this as a strategy to see, might I know this, right? Might I know this? But all the research points to, when our students have a strong native language and when we have strong native language vocabulary, this really helps the students to think about, the new words that they're learning, and they will do better in their second language when they have that strong native language vocabulary. But we want to get it to a deeper level. We want to get to that deep processing and that analytic thinking. And so when we think about that, is we want to think about words. We want to think about how they're used and how we might go about that. And so as Sherilyn talks about that, she even talks about how, like, even through the shared book reading, how structured it is for processing and analytic thinking. Day one of the routine, they are introducing the thematic unit. They're introducing and working on the background knowledge, building the background knowledge, and they're trying to figure out the words that the students already know, and words that are going to be very useful words. Isabel Beck and her colleagues talk about those academic words that are useful as tier 2 words, right? And in our studies, and Isabel Beck writes about them for English learners, we find that tier 2 words are important. Academic words are very important. You must teach it to English learners and they must learn all about this, but that also tier 1 words are important because they typically have multiple meanings, right? And so we want the students to have that opportunity to have that introduction. And now it's still day 2. We're on the same topic, same thing. We're reading, we're getting what they learned from the day before. We're adding it to today. We're asking those open-ended questions that hopefully will get at the language and the word use that we're striving for, right? And then we continue. Day 3, we're introducing new, even more vocabulary words that are visually represented. And we really work at that, looking at those words, analyzing those words, and thinking about, how can we build other words from that word, from that. And then by day 5 of the cycle, it's this cumulative review and of all the words, all the concepts that they've learned, right, from those thematic units and from that shared book reading and from that making connections across the language. And we have scaffolded that language as English as a second language. And so I think that's very essential. And like I said, these studies have been replicated and found to be effective even as they are what we call scaled up, that where you do a study and it's found effective, then you have to demonstrate that you can do it in other places. And so these have been scaled up and found to be effective. And so in figure 7.1, just really talking about those morphology and about making those connections across the languages, Dr. Durandolo talks about word parts and talks about using these suffixes to generate words related. So if you look right there, oops, I just saw typo. I'll have to fix that. It's going to bother me. So right here, you see that now. Well, we can actually look at it in different ways, right? So if we see this, so let's just take a look. This is, building the word building. And so what you see here is we see the verb, and the verb is collect. Can you say the verb? Collect. How many syllables does it have? Collect. You open your mouth 2 times. That has 2 syllables, 2 vowel sounds, right? When we collect something, what are some things we can collect? We can gather them. And so if we're talking about, we're talking about the sciences, I can collect rocks, right? Or if I'm talking about music, I can collect songs or musical instruments, right? And if we're talking about social studies, I can collect, artifacts, or I can collect things related to a certain type of population in history. So as we look at that, that word is collect, but we can use the word in a different way. And so when we add, for example, we're adding the person who collects. So let's look at that person is a collector, right? That OR and that suffix means the person who. So the collector is the person who, collects. I can also have it be a noun when I say collection, right? So, you might go and take a collection, for people in need, or they might do that at, some of your religious services to help support their outreach. And then so that is a noun, right? Names a person, place, thing or animal. But I can also change the part of speech. And this is collectible, right? It will makes it an adjective, and that adjective really makes it a describing word. And so as we think about that, students are here learning the word, right? And they're also learning about the structure of that English language, right? Because they're looking at perhaps content related text. And their goal is to develop these metacognitive awareness and these strategies for building other words, right? And this is to think about the words and consciously think about the different ways it could be used and the different ways that suffixes can help that. But I can use this as also I can add maybe even some prefixes to it, that maybe like, was there ever a pre-collection, who knows, done before the actual collection. And so we know that English learners can really develop this metacognitive awareness, and through this metacognitive awareness of generating words, we find that these are good word building strategies for our students. Any questions on that one about for building for those word parts? And we know that this is an effective strategy. Probably you do some of this work in your classroom. Shall I stop for a moment and see? I feel like I'm just talking.
There have been a few questions that came up, Elsa, and you actually just addressed one. A participant had asked, what are some of the techniques for word building?
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly, you've covered that one.
Right.
A teacher was asking for some clarification around what the name of the study was that was talking about the impact of kindergarten vocabulary on reading in middle.
So that was, one study was done by Hollis Scarborough, and I think it was in the Reading Research Journal, and then another study was done by Keith Stanovich. So those are like some, big ones that were these longitudinal looks. I can perhaps during can get you those specific studies in the journals in which you can read about them.
And then someone asked about what would be the maximum number of vocabulary to teach. There's so many lists of vocabularies and definitions, but there's really not just one.
Yeah, so I think I think the message this evening is that, so what I'd like to talk about is perhaps not thinking about lists so much. Let me just kind of stop this for a moment. I want to look at you all. For some reason, I can't see you very well. So I do want to talk to you about that. Thanks for asking that question. But I think that's what we're trying to get away from. That, here's, this list of words that you have to know. And I think the message, and it's the message you're getting from the standards too, these national standards, and the message that you're getting from the research that's being conducted, that it's more about, we have a bigger picture here. And the bigger picture is, we want to expand individuals' world knowledge, and we want them to be successful academically, and we want them to succeed in the content areas, right? And so I think the message that we want for instructors, across the content areas, is that you're a language teacher, right? And that you're a literacy teacher. And that in this world of language, think about how Dr. Duradola started the chapter. She referred to the phonology, the semantics, the morphology, the syntax, and the pragmatics. If we take what we do using that framework of language and bringing it into listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and that the words that we're going to do, so what we need to know is what words are going to best help this student understand the content of what they must learn. We have to learn certain information across these content areas, and there's certain vocabulary that's essential for that. Now, you know that Isabel Beck talks about those words that are not very generalizable, right? And so, talks about, well, these are, cerebellum. Well, that is so specific, right, to an area of study. But even if it's specific, you are going to have to learn it to master the conceptualization of that information within that area of study. So, so the work we've been doing is really trying to make our mathematics instructors, our social studies instructors, our language arts instructors, our science instructors, all the instructors really take it from, no matter what you're teaching, that you're teaching it from the framework of, I'm going to really embed these language components. I'm going to use the best word learning strategies, and I'm going to be very intentional about the planning so that they can use and have those multiple opportunities for use. And I think, we have to get away from, here's a word list, here it is, and learn it. We used to do that. Here are the top 100 words that you need to know that'll be across, but more we're using this for the benefit of really getting that content knowledge that our students need. Now, when we're talking about an English learner, and if they're the beginning stages, we know that they need to know some basic vocabulary, and that's why we talk about that. And typically, if they already have that concept, a basic knowledge in their native language, we just need to teach them the new label to it, right? But oftentimes, the way we use words is much more. Well, I'll give you an example. So the English language has, close to 1 million words, and our language has the most precision. And what I want to meet, let me give you an example. So we have to teach also our students about the intensity of words and when words are going to be used. So I'll give you an example. So I've had, a problem this week, like most people have had. And so the problem has been, what has been the problem? So this problem that we've had is, okay, we don't have electricity, and there's not gasoline, and there's not abundance of food, and you're cold, and what have you. But when we think about something that's a problem, let's think about, so some problems can be very intense. Like if I were in an earthquake, that problem becomes a catastrophe, a disaster, right? Right now, I'm just at a problem level. If something terrible happens because of the problem we're experiencing, it could become a disaster, right? I forgot to pack my perfume when I went to go see Antonio Fierro in El Paso. So was that a catastrophe? Well, a person like me that loves perfume, that would be a catastrophe. But no, it was just a little glitch there. I can quickly. So when we think about, I can tell you about 50 words that have something to do with the problem, but I want to also teach the students about how we use words, and we have more precise words in describing, right? So some things will be more intense, some words will be more intense and dramatic than other words. They have kind of the same meanings. They might even be considered synonyms, but the way we use them and that intensity of that. And so I think, if a person's learning English as a second language, that could be, just the different ways that and I like what you're putting here, the different shades of meaning. It's a very nice way of putting it. And so English learners will need to know those shades of meaning very clearly. Does that make sense?
Elsa, we also have another, thanks for answering that. We also have another question here from someone who it brings up this idea that it's tricky to teach the academic vocabulary across the curriculum, from reading to science, from levels 1 to level 2. Do you have any advice regarding teaching academic vocab to those who are very limited ELPs?
Yeah, so
and then they go on to talk about ESSA and watering down content, not wanting to water down the content, but it allows very little time for the kids to do a lot of that gradual release.
Yeah. So so I'm just going to tell you something that we experienced recently, that we had to get everybody, like so many people involved, and I don't know if the problem has been resolved, but so what I want to just kind of guard against and really be the advocate for these students who will become multi-literate or biliterate at the least, is that I hear what you're saying is watering down the curriculum, right? They're just as smart as any other student, but we in this country, we've become, I guess, fearful of our English learners not performing. And so I'll give you an example. Right now there's discussion about like the nation's report card, and that for English learners, for the nation's report card, what we'll do so that their reading comprehension will be more fair is that before they read the passage, we'll give them things like give them visuals and tell them about the theme and tell them about what it's going to be about, and then they'll read it. Well, in my mind, when we look at, reading comprehension, we might have to read information that we don't we don't have as much knowledge, right? But we're still being measured on the knowledge that we are reading. Can we put that together? Can we make an inference? Can we figure out if that was a problem or a solution or a cause effect, what have you? And so one of the things I want to warn about, and I'm glad you're talking about that, is our goal is for them to get the content and to make our instruction comprehensible to them, right? And so all the while we're taking into consideration those language proficiency levels, right? And some of you are describing, well, this is a person who's at the very beginning stages, right? And so at those very beginning stages, then I'm going to perhaps, give some of those visuals. Perhaps I'm going to do more concrete teaching. Perhaps I will, slow my rate of speech down. Perhaps I might also instructed in simpler terms. Perhaps I will, have them draw out and try and get to that comprehension. But I'm going to teach them the words that they need to use to get to that level of where they can communicate about this knowledge at an academic level. And we know that that takes years to develop. It's not going to happen overnight, but we know that we can make gains, and we can make significant gains. Even in one school year, we can make tremendous gains in their language knowledge and in their word knowledge and in their content knowledge. And so I think that's very important. And I saw something come up in the chat just right now as I was speaking about, well, what if their native language isn't that strong? And so sometimes I get the question of, what if they have no language? Well, everybody has language, right? It's just to what depth do you have that language, and how wide is that vocabulary, and how capable are you of expressing that in complete sentences, what have you. But we build upon what they know. How did Dr. Duradola start? We build upon what they know, right, from that native language, and we use what they know for that second language. And it may be that, oh, well, what they know is so little. Well, even if I'm teaching the English language, and I mentioned this one in chapter 2, that I'm still going to look back and say, did you know you also have this? And had you ever heard anyone use this word? And when we put that, those are cognates, or those are words that are similar with their morphemes. That kind of a work is important. Okay, so let me show you. So Dr. Duradola has another example here, and I wanted to show it to you. And so in figure 7.2, she talks about using word connections to expand content enrich vocabulary knowledge, right? And she says, in general, you have these, people use these semantic maps, right, to look at these key points in vocabulary building, right? But what she's demonstrating here is how you might use word consciousness, and so we call that word consciousness. And so it might be in social studies, and we're talking about this issue, and we can have these discussions about, about pollution, that being the noun, pollution. And, you know, pollution, what does that mean to you? Have you ever seen some of the rivers and some of the pollution? Or have you seen, for example, even driving down maybe the highway, you've seen people throw trash, or you've seen your rivers have trash in them, or your oceans. So pollution, you know, how can we get rid of pollution? Or maybe we have air pollution, right, where there's smog in our city. And so strategically talking about pollution, bringing in those visuals, the examples of pollution, and maybe also what we call the non-examples. So the examples and non-examples, this is, you know, the air that is polluted, but here we are out in, you know, the sea, and there's not, you know, pollution. And then from there, we can talk about, you know, the verb that, you know, how was this pollution created? Well, it was created when someone, right, actually did pollute. And that means, you know, someone was responsible for throwing these items, perhaps in the oceans or the rivers or the highways, or, you know, our use of, you know, these, you know, too much, you know, or using, you know, too much, you know, we have too many cars, or and they're not following the rules about preventing pollution, etc. And then, you know, in the past tense, you know, in the past tense, we used to pollute, and we had polluted, but now we're getting better at, you know, managing pollution. And so in the past tense, it can be polluted, but we can also use it as an adjective, you know. So the polluted ocean, or the polluted river, the polluted highway, the polluted air, right? And what is the thing that is polluting? It's called the pollutant, right? And so you can just look right here. We could have these discussions, and once again, look at the grammatical features, looking at the use, looking at that we can use visuals, and we can have examples and non-examples to describe that. And so I thought that was a very nice example that Dr. Duradola shared in the book. All right. So, you know, to put all these things into practice, we want to immerse English learners in listening and speaking and reading and writing these new words during content enriched instruction. You see this kind of messaging that goes across the standards that you're now familiar with. And we want to engage in that intentional planning and determine, well, which words am I going to teach that's going to get this message for the content across? And then as I'm teaching it, how can I use those word building strategies that I know have been found to be effective? And, you know, what will I do in my classroom now from hearing about teaching vocabulary to English learners? Have I tried some of these techniques? And if so, you know, how did they work, or what are, you know, some other ideas that I can incorporate these word learning strategies? Any thoughts on that? So we have about 5 minutes for a discussion, and I have question 1 and 2 there. So I'd like to take a look at you guys, not talk to myself. So some thoughts or things that people want to share before we wrap up this evening.
Elsa, it's Amy. One of the comments I'm seeing, or one of the questions, is asking about studies done on primary elementary school age kids.
So Dr. Duradola's studies were in primary classrooms, right? And then our studies were done in K through 3. And then the studies that we did with Dr. August were in 6th grade classrooms, right? Sharon Vaughn and her team at the University of Texas have done in with adolescents. And so, and Dr. Duodola has also worked in early childhood and done these same techniques in the early childhood classrooms as well. So early childhood and early elementary has been Dr. Duradola's work, and our work has been like in K through 3, and then the work, and then also the work that we're doing on MTSS, the multi-tiered systems of support, is in 3rd through 5th grade, and you know, that's what we've done. And so there's actually a practice guide on adolescence and adolescent teaching and learning for the from IES, the Institute for Education Sciences practice guides, and really looking at adolescent learners and thinking about that. And so I think that will address kind of like your middle school and maybe your high school students. But no matter the age, what we're finding is, number one, connections across the language. Number two, we're finding that word building and that word consciousness. This is what we're finding works, and it can work across. And you may not think that young children can do this, but young children love learning about words and using words. And I so the 4-year-old you know, grandson bringing in the visor, and I'm like, do you know why it's called a visor? And he's like, no, why? And I go, because it has viz in it, and that means to see, and it has or, it's the thing that helps you to see. So the visor's helping you to see in the sun. And look what I'm using. What do I use? Glasses. I go, do you know what it helps me with? He goes, vision. I go, my vision. That's right. Helps me to see. And then I said, you were a visitor, right? When you went to see your great grandpa. What did you go do? You went to see him, and you paid him a visit, and you were the person who visited him. You were the visitor. And then he says, and Harry Potter wears an invisible cloak. Do you know why it's invisible? He calls me Amma, and I'm like, no, why? He goes, you're not able to see him when he wears the invisible cloak. That was a 4-year-old. And so just in a little discussion there, these rich discussions, it was visor, it was visit, it was visitor, it was vision, and he came up with invisible. And so these language rich opportunities really make a difference. And the principal says, I always go in to see what words I'm going to learn from little Andrew. And I said, you know, all your children can learn this through word consciousness, through word learning strategies, through their shared book reading, through the work on morphology. And we can do this work with young children. We can do it with upper elementary children, and we can do it with children in middle school and in high school. Very clearly, these are effective as we look across that. And it's so much fun. I always have fun. That's the main thing. Have fun. And the children will love to have fun. And I tell them, you're going to be the little word detectives, and we're going to come up with these words. And some of the schools have really embraced this. Like, so the principal goes crazy because you're seeing the results and so excited about the results. And so, you know, she has this one principal has this like tree that they built. It was all out of that, you know, crepe paper, and the children all had these little they looked like leaves, and they all had contests about who could come up with the most words from this root, and the one at the end of the week that came up with the most, they got the pizza party, right? And the kids will do anything for a pizza party. But it was the whole school thinking about, you know, words and where words come from, and how they can build words and use words. And it was even in the announcements every day, you know, when a child would come up with something that was an unusual word that they built from these word parts. And so you can make it fun, and the children will always remember it. I have a student who's now in his 30s. He's about to get married, and I got an invitation, and I saw him when he was a little guy. And he says, you know what I remember? And he goes, one of my favorite lessons was when you were teaching me about port, and I remember the porta potty, and he took me across the seat to see the porta potty, and now I understand that you can carry it, and I'll never forget that root port and all the different words. And I'm like, okay, that was like more than 20 years ago, but that was impactful for him. Questions?
I was going to say, we're actually running a bit out right to the
sorry.
8 o'clock, Dr. Cardenas.
Oh gosh, I don't know where the time goes.
It goes like a whip.
Thank you all. Thank you for hanging out with us.
We are so grateful that you have braved the weather and all of your unfortunate circumstances to join us today. We're very grateful. And so many comments about how wonderful and how much they appreciate the information. We'll debrief a little bit. Maybe we can put some of the most Dr. Duradola's research with the early elementary students. Maybe grab some of her things. I know
studies. And I think she put them in the reference list as well. So
She did. And then there's a project. She talks about her project words.
the owls and the, yeah.
So we might be able to add some things, but we are so grateful for all of you for joining us tonight. Thank you again to Dr. Cardenas-Hagan and Dr. Fierro for coming to us from Texas to share this wealth of knowledge. My colleagues, Dr. Kirsten DeRoche and Amy Cavalier, are always so much fun to hang out with on a Thursday night. Unfortunately, Dr. Kastner is unable to come back into the meeting for some reason, so she just asked us to close. We will make sure there is an Act 48 to fill out. Kirsten, do you have that? Oh, there she is. She's got the poll. She's got it. So please make sure you fill out the poll. You'll be awarded credit at the end of this. And if there's any last questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will make sure to preserve them to ask.
Thank you guys. Stay safe, warm, be careful out in the cold.